Brandon Lee couldn't breathe. Not because of illness, not because of anything physically wrong, but because something inside him had collapsed. Quietly, invisibly. It started after he lost his job at a local gym during the pandemic. Then came the divorce. 9 years of marriage, gone in silence and separate apartments. He spent nights on the couch, staring at the ceiling, blinking through the dark, waiting for the tightness in his chest to let go. Sometimes he'd curl up on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m., hands shaking, heart racing, whispering, "What is happening to me?" Across town in Seattle, June Harper sat alone in her kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. She was a nurse, 55, and had survived the worst of COVID on the ICU floor. But now, in the silence that followed, she found herself unable to rest. Her son, who'd slipped into depression during lockdown, had stopped talking to her. She didn't blame him. She blamed herself. Every breath she took felt like guilt she couldn't exhale. 2 people. 2 different lives. Same invisible wound. They weren't looking for enlightenment. They just wanted to breathe again without fear. This is not a story about fixing everything. It's about the healing power of just breathing. And how one simple human act, so overlooked, so ordinary, can become a doorway to something sacred when the world inside you has fallen apart. Brandon didn't believe in meditation, or breathing exercises, or anything that sounded like sitting quietly and doing nothing. He was a man of movement, former fitness coach, boot camp trainer, the kind of guy who measured life in sweat and soreness. But after months of joblessness, loneliness, and anxiety attacks that came like waves in the middle of the night, he was out of options. One night, after another failed attempt to fall asleep, he typed, "How to Stop Panic Attacks," into YouTube. Among the noise of experts and ads, one thumbnail caught his eye. Sit, breathe, begin again. No music, no promises, just a man in his 60s, seated cross-legged in a park, eyes closed. Brandon clicked. The video didn't try to explain much. The man just invited viewers to sit, to feel their breath, to stay. Brandon didn't expect anything, but he did it anyway. He sat up on the couch, back hunched, hands cold. He followed the man's words. Inhale. Exhale. Again. By the 4th breath, something strange happened. He started crying. It wasn't a dramatic sob. It was quiet, like a leak in a pipe that had been holding too much pressure. Tears slid down without effort. He hadn't cried when his wife left. Not when he cleaned out his gym locker, not even when he canceled the lease on the apartment they were supposed to move into together. But here, in the stillness of a stranger's voice and the rhythm of his own breath, it cracked. That moment became the beginning. The next morning, he found the name of the man in the video. Daniel Park, a retired therapist turned meditation teacher, now offering free group sits in Green Lake Park. Brandon didn't tell anyone. He just showed up. At first he felt ridiculous. People were sitting in silence like statues, eyes closed, breathing as if it meant something. He didn't know what he was supposed to feel. He didn't want to close his eyes, but he stayed. 5 minutes. Then 10. Then 20. No one said a word to him, and strangely that felt kind. After the sit, Daniel walked over, not with a smile or a teaching, but with a chair. He sat down next to Brandon, matched his posture, and breathed. No advice, no explanation, just presence. Brandon sat with him in silence, almost annoyed by how simple it was. And yet, as the minutes passed, he realized something. For the first time in months, he wasn't afraid of his own body. The breath wasn't just air. It was anchor. It didn't fix anything. But it reminded him, "You're still here." Daniel would later tell him something Brandon never forgot. Breath is what's left when everything else is gone. It's your first companion. And often, the last. Brandon kept returning. Week after week, he'd show up to sit. No big expectations, no magical breakthroughs, just the ordinary work of being still. He learned how shallow his breathing had been, how often he'd been holding his breath without realizing. He started to notice the space between inhale and exhale, that brief, empty pause. That was the hardest part. It felt like death, like the moment right before something terrible happens. But Daniel taught him to stay there. "It's not death," he said. "It's where rebirth begins." There was no religion in it, no chants, just the breath. But gradually, Brandon began to understand what Buddhist teachers had long whispered through centuries. The breath is not just a tool for calm, it's a doorway to presence. In Buddhist tradition, this is known as anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. It's deceptively simple. And yet, in that simplicity lies something radical. You are not asked to change your thoughts, not to fix your past, not to project into the future. You are only asked to return to this breath. This moment, it challenged everything Brandon believed about healing. He had been taught to do, to problem solve, to hustle, to figure things out. But healing, it turned out, wasn't a project. It wasn't something to be finished. It was a process of allowing. And breath was the first act of that permission. He started bringing breath into his mornings, just 5 minutes before coffee. Sometimes he'd place a hand on his chest to feel it rise. Sometimes, on anxious days, he'd sit in the car before going into the grocery store just to breathe. He'd say the same 3 words to himself. Here, now, still. They didn't make the anxiety disappear, but they gave him something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. And then one day, during a group sit, he noticed a woman sitting across from him, older, with a quiet sadness around her shoulders. She looked like someone who had also stopped believing in magic. When the session ended, she stayed sitting. Brandon didn't speak. He just sat nearby, breathing. For 20 silent minutes, they didn't look at each other. But when they stood, their eyes met, and something passed between them. Recognition. Not of shared trauma, but of shared return. The woman was June. She had her own story. But for now, all that mattered was that they were both here, breathing, together. And that was enough. June Harper didn't cry during the worst nights of the pandemic. She didn't cry when patients died. She didn't cry when her hospital ran out of oxygen tanks. She didn't even cry when her best friend and fellow nurse collapsed from exhaustion halfway through a shift. She held the line. That's what she told herself. Hold the line. Hold it for the families. Hold it for the staff. Hold it so no one else has to. But something inside her had broken. Not suddenly, but slowly, like metal worn thin. When the worst was over and the headlines moved on, June was left alone with a silence she didn't recognize. Her son, Noah, barely spoke to her anymore. He was 23, gentle, brilliant, and deeply withdrawn. He'd spiraled into depression during the lockdowns, isolating in his room, skipping meals, skipping life. She didn't know how to reach him. She tried. But every attempt felt like shouting into a cave that only echoed her own voice back. Then one morning, June found him gone. Not dead, not missing, just gone. He had left a note that said only, "I need space to figure out who I am. Please don't follow." June read it over and over again in the kitchen, hands trembling. There was no explosion, no scream. Just a silence so total, it felt like gravity had changed. She went to work the next day, and the next. But the noise in her body, what had once been adrenaline, grief, urgency, turned into something colder, emptiness. And underneath that, guilt. She couldn't breathe properly anymore. At night, she'd lie in bed, waiting for sleep that never came. When she did doze off, she'd wake gasping, like surfacing from underwater. Her doctor said it was anxiety, prescribed her something mild, but the pills didn't touch what was really wrong. She wasn't anxious. She was unraveling. One afternoon, while scrolling half-heartedly through videos on her phone, she came across a clip of a child in a hospital bed. The boy was maybe 11 or 12, eyes closed, hooked up to oxygen, whispering softly to the nurse beside him. "When I get scared, I just breathe. Like you taught me. It helps." June stared at the screen. The nurse wasn't her, but it might as well have been. She had said those words countless times to patients, especially kids. "Just breathe. I'm right here." It was her mantra, her promise. She had taught so many others how to breathe through fear, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten how to do it herself. That night, she sat on her living room floor, wrapped in a blanket, unsure what she was even looking for. She remembered a practice she'd heard about once. 3 mindful breaths. Something Buddhist, something simple. She didn't have the energy to meditate. But 3 breaths that she could try. She inhaled slowly and whispered in her mind, "Here." Exhaled. "Now." Again. "Still." Tears came, not dramatic, not loud. Just soft rivers she didn't try to stop. She did it again. And again. No expectations, no trying to feel better, just breathing with what was. That became her quiet ritual. The next morning she dug up an old journal and wrote 5 words on the first page. "I breathed. I am here." She didn't tell anyone, not even her therapist, but she kept returning to the breath each day, before coffee, after work, during those 2 a.m. wake-ups. She wasn't trying to heal anymore. She just wanted to be. And then she saw a flyer pinned to the community board at the grocery store. "Free weekly sit, mindful breathing with Daniel Park, Sundays at Green Lake." The name rang faintly. She remembered seeing one of his videos passed around among the nurses during COVID. Something gentle and grounding that helped people keep going. She almost didn't go. Almost convinced herself it was silly. But something in her body, a quiet tug, pulled her toward it. That Sunday, she arrived at Green Lake Park just before noon. People were already seated in a circle on thin mats and folded blankets, scattered beneath a row of trees. No incense, no chants, just humans breathing. She sat near the edge, unsure if she belonged. A man across from her, a little younger, a little tired-looking, met her eyes briefly, then looked down. That was Brandon. They didn't speak, but his presence felt calm. The group began to breathe together. The air was cool, damp from morning fog. June followed the guidance. Inhale. Feel the air enter your nose. Exhale. Feel your body soften. Let it be enough. Minutes passed. Then more. Her mind tried to wander. Images of Noah, of her empty kitchen, of bedsides and beeping machines. But each time she brought herself back to the breath. After the session ended, she didn't get up right away. She stayed. So did Brandon. 20 silent minutes passed before they stood, neither saying a word. But their eyes met again. This time, something shifted, like 2 travelers who recognized the weight in each other's pack. The next week, she came back. She began to read more about Buddhist practice, not the philosophy, not the theology, just the way breath was used as an anchor, a home. She discovered Anapanasati in its original Pali, literally, mindfulness of breathing. It wasn't a technique. It was a way of returning to the present, to the body, to life. She also learned something that startled her. In Buddhist tradition, breath is not just a calming tool. It is the first step in awakening. The Buddha's own path began with sitting under a tree and following his breath, not solving a problem, not fixing his pain, just sitting, just breathing. June started to think differently about what healing really meant. It wasn't about getting over anything. It wasn't about putting pieces back together. It was about letting herself be seen, by herself, without shame, without rush. She still didn't have all the answers. Noah hadn't returned her calls. The house still felt too quiet. But she didn't run from the silence anymore. Instead, she breathed with it. Sometimes she'd write one line in her journal before bed. I breathed. That was enough. And somehow, night by night, that line began to feel true. It was a Sunday afternoon when Brandon and June finally spoke. The meditation session had just ended. The group was dispersing slowly, people folding blankets, sipping tea from thermoses, exchanging quiet smiles. Brandon was brushing pine needles off his mat when June walked over. She didn't plan what to say. She just stood beside him and offered a simple, "Hi." Brandon looked up, nodded. "Hey." There was a pause. Not awkward, just spacious. Then June said, "I've been coming here for a few weeks now." "I've noticed," Brandon replied. "You sit like you've done this forever." She smiled, small and honest. "I cry most of the time." He nodded, his voice low. "Me too." That was the beginning of their quiet friendship, one built not on shared interests or even deep conversation, but on the unspoken understanding that they were both survivors of something invisible. They started sitting near each other every Sunday. Sometimes they exchanged a few words, sometimes just a nod. But the stillness between them began to feel like safety. Over time, they discovered that healing wasn't always about talking it out. Sometimes, healing happened when you shared space with someone who didn't try to fix you. One Sunday, as they walked along the path circling the lake after the session, Brandon asked, "Do you ever feel like you're rebuilding yourself, but you don't know what the new shape is?" June thought for a moment. "I feel like I'm not rebuilding. I'm just resting in the rubble and trying not to panic." They both laughed, a soft release. Later that week, they met at a cafe. No plan, just tea and presence. Brandon told her about his old gym, the one he dreamed of opening again someday. Not for athletes, but for people recovering from burnout, grief, trauma. A space where people could move their bodies without trying to become someone else. June told him about Noah, how sometimes she imagined him reading her texts and choosing not to reply. That hurt more than not knowing at all. Brandon didn't offer comfort. He just listened. And in that listening, something softened. One afternoon, during a sit, Daniel introduced a new practice, the pause between breaths. "Inhale," he said. "Pause. Exhale. Pause." That tiny space between, Daniel explained, is where life is most alive. Most people skip over it, but that's where we learn to stay with ourselves, without reaching, without running. Brandon felt something shift. He had always rushed through those pauses. They felt like empty moments. But now, he wondered, what if the pause is the point? June later described it differently. "It's like standing on a bridge. You're not where you were. You're not where you're going. You're just in between. And for once, that's okay." Those pauses became sacred, not just in breathing, but in life. June began to notice the pause between waking and rising. The moment when the sun hit her window but she hadn't moved yet. Brandon noticed the pause between a text and the decision to respond. That brief breath where reaction could become intention. The more they paid attention to these small spaces, the more healing seemed to happen. Not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a slow remembering. A remembering of self, of peace, of something deeper than survival. And then something remarkable occurred. June received a letter in the mail. It was from Noah. A real letter, handwritten. Inside, he wrote, "I'm not ready to talk yet, but I wanted you to know I'm okay. I've been going to a meditation group. Found it through a YouTube video some nurse had liked years ago. Weird how things circle back, huh? I'm breathing better now. Slowly. Just wanted you to know." June sat with the letter in her lap, the ink smudged where her tears had fallen. She didn't call him. She didn't write back. Not yet. She just breathed and said softly, "Thank you." Brandon didn't have a dramatic turn like that. His ex-wife didn't come back. The gym didn't reopen. But something inside him changed anyway. He stopped measuring days by productivity. He stopped asking himself if he was doing enough. Instead, he measured the quality of his presence. Did I breathe with my coffee this morning? Did I notice the breeze through the window? Did I meet myself with kindness, even if only once? One morning, he stood at the edge of Green Lake as mist curled off the water. The sky was soft, early gray. He closed his eyes and let the air fill his lungs. The inhale arrived slowly. The pause held. The exhale left gently. No rush, no pressure, just breath. It wasn't a spiritual high. It wasn't enlightenment. It was ordinary. But it was enough. That's what they were learning. Not just Brandon and June, but everyone who sat in that quiet circle each week. That breath in its simplicity carries wisdom that words cannot. That healing doesn't always come with insight. Sometimes it arrives in a pause, in a presence, in a moment where you don't abandon yourself. Breathing, they realized, wasn't just a biological function. It was a relational act. It was how they stayed with themselves when the world wanted them to escape. It was how they re-entered their bodies, their lives, their hearts, one inhale at a time. Brandon once asked Daniel, "When does it get better?" Daniel smiled, placed a hand over his heart, and said, "It gets better when you stop needing it to, and just breathe where you are." In that moment, Brandon understood. Healing wasn't ahead of him. It wasn't something he had to chase or achieve. It was already here, in this breath, in this pause, in this quiet, shared moment of being fully, tenderly alive. Brandon still doesn't have his gym back. June still hasn't spoken to Noah. The world hasn't returned to some perfect, healed version of itself. And maybe it never will. But something has shifted. Something quiet. Something real. They both still sit every Sunday under those tall pines near the lake. Sometimes alone, sometimes side by side. They still don't talk much. But when their eyes meet across the circle, there's a kind of knowing, a shared truth that words can't hold. Brandon breathes before he answers emails now. June breathes before she blames herself. Neither of them considers themselves spiritual. They're not trying to be enlightened or fixed. They're just practicing staying present. One breath at a time. And that's the secret no one tells you. The healing doesn't come from effort or epiphany. It comes from staying, from not leaving yourself when everything else falls apart, from sitting in the middle of the ache and choosing to breathe anyway. You don't have to know what to do next. You don't have to be okay right now. You don't even have to believe this will work. Just sit, just breathe, just begin again. And if something in this story stayed with you, if something quiet inside you whispered yes, then maybe this is your moment, not to fix anything, but to come home to yourself. Try it now. One breath. Inhale. Here, exhale. Now. Let that be enough for today. And when you're ready, I'll meet you in the next story, where we talk about how to start again, gently, because sometimes the next chapter doesn't begin with a plan. It begins with presence. There's something sacred about a single breath taken with awareness. It doesn't fix your past. It doesn't promise a perfect future. But it gives you a place to stand. Right here, in this moment, where life is still unfolding. Maybe no one taught you how to stay when things fell apart. Maybe you were told to move on, push forward, or be strong. But there is another way. A quieter way. The way of simply being with yourself, exactly as you are, without judgment. Brandon and June didn't find answers. What they found was space. Space to breathe, to feel, to exist without having to justify their pain or their healing. And in that space, something softened, not because they forced it, but because they stayed. That's the invitation. To trust that you are not behind. You are not broken. You are not too late. You are breathing. And that means you're already on the path. So the next time you feel overwhelmed or numb or lost, pause. Inhale. Exhale. And remember, you don't need to do anything extraordinary to begin again. You just need to come home to this breath, this body, this now. And from there, everything else can unfold.